of all, we see a red playing figure, and the red playing figure hints at the individualization we want to lay out. And therefore, we first of all want to present the individualization of sustainable goals in class. Then secondly, we want to criticize the competence model. Thirdly, we want to emphasize the criticism of the moralization laid out in school material. And after all our criticism, we want to finish or end up with some hope within religious education. But first and foremost, we may have some bad news. You see the SDG achievement chart of all UN countries, of all 193 UN countries. We can see absolutely no SDG progress overall or worldwide. So the progress is too slow. Or do we have good news after all? Because as we can see, Germany is fourth in the SDG index. So the score can be interpreted as a percentage of SDG achievements. A score of 100 indicates that all SDGs have been achieved. Thus, Germany as a country is doing well concerning SDGs considered separately. And you will see Germany is our metaphor here. So this separation, in other words, individualization, is represented within the subjects in school and the competence model. So let's have a look at the school subject, for example, social science. Okay, so we see that the ESD is instrumentalized when the political responsibility for sustainable development is transferred solely to the pupil or the consumer. The emphasis is placed on the action orientation of the individual. Here the German quote from Birgit Weber of 2005. Children today are already afraid of global challenges, while often they are still being asked to make individual contributions. So the competence orientation at school, particularly the Handlungskompetenz, is kind of lays the burden onto the shoulders of the pupil in school. So Axel will now criticize the competence model.
Yeah, thank you. I think we should remember that subject orientation comes from the anthropological turn in religious education. Today, it has become a central guiding principle, but from a historical perspective, it is associated with the rejection of a deductive, normative, and externally controlled model of education. The high value of the freedom of choice of the learning subject can be demonstrated across many principles of religious education, as you know. In contrast, postulates that are regarded as irrefutable norms are currently emerging in educational discourse, particularly in education for sustainable development. Here arises one special problem. How can we harmonize postulates that appear to be inescapable with the freely deciding subject? How can we interlink the consequences of individual forms of action and lifestyle options and their societal upcoming? We need to orientate towards external norms of behavior and the reference to nature and technology in religion. But in particular, we need to describe the relationship between the self-design of young people and these normative implications. Sustainability in this regard is an interpretation of our also technically determined way of life and the shaping of the nature-culture process. So possibilities of self-positioning beyond heteronomous orientation open up. Competence orientation aims to impart skills that can be evaluated. It is certainly possible to emphasize the concept of competence in a different way, but since sustainable action is about measurable facts, such as carbon emissions, the ecological footprint, or water balance, we can assume that competences should also lead to measurable results. In fact, although we are able to identify a number of individual events with climate change, the interpretation of selective experiences must be distinguished from the description of global change. Individual events are different to something what happens globally. Teachers certainly always have the opportunity to customize the requirements that are introduced into lessons through concepts such as ESD. However, I would like to point out that the tendency towards fixed competences suggests a focus on rule-based behavior, but ethical behavior follows the sense of freely responsible and therefore always potentially fallible decisions. And this is, I think, more in keeping with the nature of religious education in a democratic school system than the adoption of other people's routines. If education for sustainable development is viewed from such an ethical position, then a different objective arises for religious education. It would have to address the understanding of reality associated with sustainability that underlies our culture of climate change. Specifically, it is about the two dimensions of our culture, this is nature and technology. In theology, technology is traditionally the place where the vulnerability of autonomy to abuse is negotiated. Also, theology admits that modern man has the potential to act autonomously. It considers the realization of this autonomy to be either an abuse or a threat to it. And with regard to climate change, in religious education, we actually know that the direct orientation towards nature hardly seems possible. Rather, the concept of creation refers to the task of preserving nature in the form of the nature-culture process and thereby subjecting technical forms of action. One possible explanation for the omission of technology in religious education could be that technology is seen as the motor of secularization. Nature, on the other hand, would be the reserve of the religious spiritual. But we now need to clarify what would distinguish an education for sustainable development in religious education from the teaching of sustainability skills and competences only.
It's funny to listen to him with a voice from above. It's almost like God, but gladly we can see him later on. So there's a high level of interest among teachers in addressing SDGs in class. But still, the emphasis lies in the possible change of the individual behavior, as Weselijk puts it. According to Weselijk, teachers often trivialize the complex topics of the sustainability discourse, for example, by leaving out perspectives critical of power and domination in favor of a more comprehensible and uncontroversial practice of moral behavioral demands, Praxis der moralischen Verhaltensaufforderung. And this goes hand in hand with the observation from school material for religious education. So we have brought you two current examples from many others which deal with the topic about climate justice. First of all, this is from Miserior. The material is also on the topic of climate justice and uses the question to rhetorically focus on the individual possibility of taking action against global warming. The second example from last year, like many others, also uses the option of calculating your own carbon footprint, something the measurable facts Axel already mentioned. And as we know, the oil company BP has introduced the carbon footprint calculator in 2004 that has since enabled individuals to calculate how much carbon emissions they are responsible for. With this advertising campaign, BP skillfully diverted attention from the massive carbon footprint of oil companies to the individuals. So the burden is placed on a single person to cover up the responsibility of the system, or in this case, of the oil industry. And with regards to Michael Roth, who wrote about the moral apostle, der Moralapostel, this praxis der moralischen Verhaltensaufforderung comes very close to moralization. So, and we can like put in Michel Foucault's pastoral care, pastoral power as well, but we have different points of views and therefore a power imbalance. So if I criticize someone that he or she is flying, I am somehow right, but still in what I say, but I speak from a different level of communication. Seine moralische Rede hat die Funktion, uns herabzudrücken. So he looks at us, the moral apostle looks at us from above, and by measuring our behavior against an abstract order. But let's close with some hope, Axel.
The problem of assigning pedagogy and ethics lies in the question of how theology relates to positive morality. Is it a moral agency or a reflection of the purposes that have always been present and determine the individual in the historical process? Religious education would still be trapped in this kind of rational positivism if it committed itself to the simply guiding principle of an image of the future. But education is not about an ideal of what teachers want young people to do. Such ideals would fall under the prohibition of images, which we know from religion. Instead, students should make of the world in which they live according to their own ideas. If, for example, what many young people experience nowadays, they have a visual and a real experience of the concrete loss of nature in the form of, as you see here, a forest dieback. Then only the inclusion of our technical forms of action will clarify whether what we are really talking about. Do we talk about the loss of a primeval forest, of an artificially created national park, or of a farm of trees? The question of what is actually being lost and to what extent this can be categorized as a loss is therefore very complex. These differentiations must not be ignored when reflecting on action. Students should recognize, among other things, that we cannot deal with environmental crisis from the outside. We are part of the crisis. That means the environmental crisis is also a crisis of perception. We can only grieve for a forest through any relation to the same. Only such a forest can be managed sustainably. Sustainability needs relationship. So the guiding principle of sustainability should therefore always be subject to the proviso that they can be deconstructed. Any relationship can be deconstructed. But in this sense, establishing a relationship with the non-human should be understood as a form of education. Religious education is the place where students must be challenged to make up their own minds. Such a statement cannot and should not be anticipated by a fixed program, but rather pedagogically induced in accordance with the current state of religious education. The aim is to realize one's own conception of self and the world in relation to the existing morality of climate change and within the horizon of Christian proclamation. In particular, the rightly desired consent of individuals to principles of sustainability depends on whether this is constructed as a commonly determined good or as a heteronomous obligation. The difference becomes immediately clear when one realizes that on the international climate stage, the surrender of civil liberties always goes hand in hand with the demand for compensation, financial compensation, you know. And this demand for financial compensation is a clear indication that the global community is not a community of responsibility oriented towards a common good. It is rather a community of different groups of interests that argue about whether sustainability should be considered a common interest at all. So ethical sustainability education, therefore, does not confront students with ideal relationships in the face of dramatic circumstances, but rather marks these images as controversial links. They are controversial. Therefore, skills are still necessary, but the decisive factor for education for sustainable development is the spirit in which we are to act. And this spirit is not an outcome of competences, it is an outcome of relations. The minimum standards, and this is what we close with, the minimum standard in ethical discourse seems to be that individual ethical decisions must be treated respectfully, but their consequences can also be considered and clearly assessed in terms of their scope. We have questioned the relation between the self-reflection and the self-reflective normativity in the sense of the principle of subject orientation and a more clearly responsible ethical approach. Our suggestion is that the way is not through the transfer of competencies, those which come from outside to the students, but through the building and reflection of relations. We need to emphasize the nature-culture nexus we and the next generation live in.
So to come to an end, it's not only the individual perspective that takes us back to the supposedly good news from the beginning. We have here the spillover ranking of all UN member states. So each country's action can have positive or negative effects on other countries' abilities to achieve their SDGs. And you can see that Germany ends up at the 143rd place. So Germany has a lot of negative effects on other countries. The impact that Germany is having on other countries in a negative way shows the systemic thinking which is needed and can bring out the ethics of responsibility, such as in compassion, more clearly. We cannot underestimate the spiritual cohesion of a society. It's not only the individual, but it's more solidarity-based options which can be achieved by teaching compassion, which is a topic we will hearing about tomorrow. To it. So even if these playing figures may look like a fan club of the 1. FC Nuremberg after a match, or the 1. FC Köln as well, it should have become clear that we need the ethics of responsibility for the spiritual cohesion of a society. And secondly, the spirit may become the gift of empowerment to shape the society or the church through the bestowal of abilities after 1 Corinthians 12. So thank you very much. Thank you very much for your attention. Axel and me.